Diego had been standing over hot stoves for 15 years. His hands bore the scars of 1,000 burns, small reminders of long nights in restaurant kitchens where the orders never seemed to stop coming. He'd started as a dishwasher when he was 23, fresh off the bus from another state, with nothing but a duffel bag and determination in his heart. Back then, he'd watch the cooks work their magic, turning simple ingredients into dishes that made people close their eyes with satisfaction. He studied them during every spare moment, volunteering to help prep vegetables just to learn the knife skills. The head chef at his first job, an older man with tired eyes, had noticed his hunger to learn and started teaching him after the dinner rush ended. Those lessons changed everything. Diego wasn't just learning recipes. He was discovering his purpose. There was something about feeding people, about creating moments of comfort and joy through food that made all the hard work worthwhile. Even on the toughest days when his feet ached and his back screamed for rest, he'd see a customer's face light up at their first bite, and he'd remember why he did this. But Diego had a bigger dream. He didn't want to spend his whole life making someone else's vision come to life. He wanted his own place, something small and cozy, where neighbors could gather over good coffee and homemade food. A place that felt like home, not just another restaurant, so he started saving. Every paycheck, Diego would set aside whatever he could. Some weeks it was $50. Other weeks, when tips were good or he picked up extra shifts, he'd manage to save $100 or more. His wife Carmen worked as a teacher's aide, and she saved too. They lived carefully, cutting every corner they could find. They bought clothes at thrift stores, cooked every meal at home, and rarely went out for entertainment. Their two kids, Sofia and little Diego, understood without being told that money was tight. When their friends got new video games or the latest phones, they didn't complain about hand-me-downs and shared devices. Carmen would tell them about their father's dream, and somehow that made the sacrifices feel worthwhile. They were all working towards something together. The years crawled by slowly. Diego moved from one restaurant to another, always looking for better pay, always learning new skills. He worked at a fancy French bistro where he learned to make perfect sauces. He spent 2 years at an Italian place where the owner taught him the secrets of fresh pasta. He did a stint at a breakfast joint where he mastered the art of fluffy pancakes and crispy hash browns. With each new job, his savings account grew a little larger. 5,000 became 10,000. 10,000 became 20. It took discipline he didn't know he had. There were moments when the sacrifice felt too heavy. When Sofia needed braces and they had to dip into the savings. When their old car finally died and they had to buy a used van. Each setback hurt, but Diego and Carmen would sit at their kitchen table late at night, recalculate their numbers, and keep pushing forward. By the time Diego turned 38, he had $45,000 saved. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for a down payment on a small commercial space. He'd been scouting locations for months, driving through different neighborhoods on his days off looking for the perfect spot. Then he found it. A tiny storefront on Maple Street, sandwiched between a barber shop and a used bookstore. The space had been empty for over a year, and it showed. The previous tenant had been a print shop that went out of business, and they'd left behind a mess. The floor tiles were cracked and stained. The walls hadn't seen fresh paint in decades. The bathroom was barely functional, and the electrical system looked like it might have been installed in the 1970s. But Diego could see past all of that. He stood in the middle of that dusty, abandoned space and saw his future. The front windows would let in beautiful morning light. There was enough room for maybe 12 tables, which was perfect. The back area was large enough for a small kitchen. He could already picture where the espresso machine would go, where he'd set up the pastry display case. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, was asking for first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. With the down payment and these upfront costs, Diego would be using almost all of his savings. It was terrifying. But Carmen squeezed his hand and said, "We didn't save for 15 years to get scared now." They signed the lease in March. Diego had 3 months before the rent started. 3 months to transform this wreck of a space into his dream cafe. He couldn't afford to hire contractors, so he decided to do most of the work himself. How hard could it be? Very hard, it turned out. But Diego was stubborn. He watched hundreds of hours of videos online, learning how to repair drywall, install light fixtures, and fix plumbing. He made plenty of mistakes at first. He had to redo the bathroom pipes 3 times before they stopped leaking. He accidentally drilled into a water line and flooded half the space. But slowly he started to get the hang of it. Carmen and the kids helped on weekends. Sophia, now 15, proved to have an eye for design, helping choose paint colors and plan the layout. Little Diego, just 11, worked alongside his father, learning to use tools and measure twice before cutting. Those weekends became precious family time, even though the work was exhausting. Diego kept his day job, working 40 hours a week at a downtown hotel restaurant. Then he'd rush to his space and work until midnight, sometimes later. He survived on coffee and pure determination. His body ached constantly, but every completed project filled him with pride. He installed new flooring himself, laying each tile with careful precision. He painted the walls a warm cream color that made the space feel bigger. He rewired most of the electrical system with help from his brother-in-law, who was an electrician. The kitchen equipment was a different challenge. Commercial stoves, refrigerators, and dishwashers were expensive, even used. Diego spent weeks searching online marketplaces and attending restaurant equipment auctions. He drove 3 hours to pick up a barely used espresso machine from a failed coffee shop. He haggled with a restaurant supply store owner until he got a decent price on a commercial refrigerator with a small dent. By early June, the space was starting to look like an actual cafe. Diego had built most of the tables himself from reclaimed wood, sanding and staining them until they glowed. Carmen had sewn cushions for the mismatched chairs they'd collected from yard sales and thrift stores. The eclectic look gave the place character, exactly what Diego had envisioned. He spent his evenings testing recipes. The menu would be simple but made with love. Fresh breakfast sandwiches, homemade soups, really good coffee, and a selection of pastries that Carmen would bake. Nothing fancy, just honest food made well. The kind of food that made people feel cared for. Diego wanted to call the place Carmen's Corner Cafe as a tribute to his wife, who had believed in him from the very beginning. She'd cried when he told her, insisting they should call it Diego's Dream instead. They compromised on Corner Cafe, agreeing that it was their shared dream now, not just his. The grand opening was scheduled for the first Saturday in September, right after Labor Day. Diego had exactly 12 weeks to finish everything, get his permits approved, do a few test runs, and spread the word in the neighborhood. It felt like just enough time if everything went according to plan. He printed flyers and walked door to door on Maple Street, introducing himself to the other business owners and nearby residents. People seemed genuinely excited about having a new cafe in the neighborhood. The bookstore owner promised to tell all her customers. The barber said he'd put a stack of flyers in his shop. Diego could barely sleep at night, his mind racing with everything still left to do. But it was the good kind of restless, the kind that comes from being close to something you've wanted for so long. He'd lie in bed next to Carmen, talking quietly about what life would be like once the cafe was open. Maybe in a few years, if things went well, they could expand. Maybe hire a few employees. Maybe even save enough to buy a house with a real backyard. For the first time in his life, Diego felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Everything he'd worked for was coming together. The dream he'd carried for 15 years was about to become real. He just had to keep pushing for a few more weeks. Nothing could stop him now. Or so he thought. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks before the grand opening. Diego had just finished a meeting with his coffee supplier, a friendly guy who'd given him a good deal on organic beans. The sun was shining and Diego felt invincible. He'd checked off another item on his endless to-do list, and the cafe was so close to being ready. Just a few more details to iron out. He was driving his old van back toward the cafe, planning to spend the rest of the afternoon installing the last of the light fixtures. The radio played an old song that reminded him of his childhood, and he caught himself humming along. Traffic was light for a Tuesday. He was stopped at a red light on 4th Avenue, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, thinking about whether he should add cinnamon rolls to the menu. The light turned green. Diego checked both ways out of habit and started through the intersection. That's when everything changed. He didn't even see the other car coming. 1 second he was driving forward, and the next there was an explosion of sound and pain. A pickup truck, running the red light at 40 miles per hour, slammed into the driver's side of his van. The impact spun Diego's vehicle completely around. Glass shattered everywhere. Metal screamed as it crumpled. Diego's head snapped sideways, then forward, then back. His leg twisted at an angle that legs shouldn't twist. Something in his chest cracked with a sound he could feel more than hear. Then everything went dark. He woke up in an ambulance, confused and unable to breathe properly. A paramedic leaned over him, saying something, but the words sounded like they were underwater. Diego tried to ask about his van, about whether he could still make it to the cafe, but when he tried to speak, white-hot pain shot through his ribs. The paramedic told him to stay still, to not try to talk. Diego's vision started to blur and he slipped away again. The next time he opened his eyes, he was in a hospital room. Carmen was there, her face pale and streaked with tears. She grabbed his hand gently, careful not to hurt him. "Thank God," she whispered. "Thank God you're alive." Diego tried to ask what happened, but his mouth was so dry. Carmen helped him take a tiny sip of water through a straw. Then she explained, her voice shaking. The other driver had been texting, didn't even see the red light. Diego's phone was totaled, but that was the least of their problems. Diego had a shattered left leg that would require surgery to repair. 3 broken ribs, a severe concussion that had them worried about brain swelling. The doctors said he was lucky. The impact had been on the driver's side, just behind where he was sitting. A few inches forward, and they said he might not have made it. Lucky. The word felt like a joke. Diego lay there, unable to move without pain, and tried to process what this meant. The surgery happened the next day. They had to put metal rods and pins in his leg to hold the bones together. The doctor said recovery would take months. First, he'd be in the hospital for a week or 2. Then he'd need a wheelchair for a while, then crutches. Physical therapy would be essential. They talked about timelines like 6 months, maybe 8, before he could stand for long periods. 6 months. 8 months. The grand opening was in 12 days. Carmen tried to stay positive. She talked about postponing the opening, about how people would understand. But Diego knew the reality. The rent didn't stop because he was hurt. They'd already paid for permits, bought inventory, advertised the opening date. And they had no disability insurance. Diego had planned to get it right after the cafe opened, once they had steady income. It was one of those things he'd been meaning to do but kept putting off. Now that decision haunted him. The medical bills started arriving almost immediately. The ambulance ride alone was $3,000. The surgery was over $40,000. Even with the basic health insurance they had through Carmen's job, their out-of-pocket costs were crushing. The hospital stay, the specialists, the medications, the follow-up appointments, the numbers kept growing. Diego lay in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, doing math in his head. The math that told him his dream was dying. He couldn't finish the cafe renovations from a hospital bed. He couldn't train staff while he was drugged up on pain medication. He couldn't cook, couldn't lift supplies, couldn't do anything. The cafe needed him, and he was broken. Carmen called Mrs. Patterson, the landlord, to explain the situation. Mrs. Patterson was sympathetic. She really was. She sent flowers to the hospital and told Carmen how sorry she felt. But she also had bills to pay. She gave them 2 months. If they couldn't open by then, she'd have to terminate the lease and find another tenant. She couldn't afford to let the space sit empty indefinitely. 2 months. Diego would barely be out of a wheelchair by then. The days in the hospital blurred together. Physical therapists came to help him start moving again. Exercises that left him sweating and shaking. The pain was constant, only dulled by medications that made him feel disconnected from reality. Friends and family visited, bringing encouragement and worried smiles. But Diego could see it in their eyes. They knew what he knew. This was the end. When he finally got home 3 weeks after the accident, the house felt different. Carmen had set up a temporary bedroom in the living room so he wouldn't have to deal with stairs. Sophia and little Diego tried to act normal, but he could feel their sadness. They'd all been so excited about the cafe. Now that excitement had turned into a heavy silence that nobody wanted to talk about. Diego spent his days in a wheelchair, moving between the makeshift bed and the window, where he could see the street outside. Carmen went back to work because they needed every penny now more than ever. The kids went to school, and Diego sat alone with his thoughts and his pain and his dying dream. The medical bills kept coming. Insurance covered some of it, but the deductible and co-pays were enormous. They'd saved $45,000 over 15 years. Within 2 months, more than half of it was gone, eaten up by medical expenses. The little bit of savings they'd set aside for emergencies also gone. They stopped paying some bills, prioritizing the critical ones. The electric bill, the water bill, food, everything else could wait. Diego tried to work from home on the cafe. He called contractors to get quotes on finishing the work he couldn't do himself. But contractors cost money they didn't have. He looked into small business loans, but banks weren't interested in lending to someone who couldn't even stand up yet and had no business history. He tried reaching out to the people who'd promised to help, but everyone had their own lives and problems. Good intentions faded when reality set in. The first month's rent came due. They paid it, draining the bank account to dangerously low levels. Diego made lists of equipment he could sell back, trying to recoup some money. The espresso machine he'd driven 3 hours to get, the refrigerator with the small dent, the tables he'd built with his own hands. He posted them online at rock-bottom prices, feeling like he was selling pieces of his soul. Carmen tried to hide how stressed she was, but Diego could see it. The way she checked the mail with dread, knowing more bills would be waiting. The way she stared at their bank statement on her phone, her face tight with worry. The way she'd slip into the bathroom to cry where she thought he couldn't hear. They'd been partners for 17 years, and he'd never felt more like he was failing her. Sophia got a part-time job at a grocery store, lying about it being for college savings instead of admitting her family was drowning. Little Diego started mowing lawns in the neighborhood for money. A kid shouldn't have to do that. But he did it without complaining, pressing $20 bills into his mother's hand with a brave smile that broke Diego's heart. The second month's rent deadline approached like a storm on the horizon. Diego knew they couldn't pay it. The money simply didn't exist. He called Mrs. Patterson to tell her they were done, that she should terminate the lease and find a new tenant. His voice cracked on the phone, and he hated himself for it. Mrs. Patterson was kind about it. She gave them an extra week to clear out their equipment and personal belongings. Diego hadn't been back to the cafe since the accident. Carmen had gone a few times to check on things, but she always came back looking sad and didn't share many details. Diego knew he needed to see it one more time before it was gone forever. He needed some kind of closure, even though the thought of facing that empty space made him want to throw up. On a cold Tuesday morning, Carmen helped him into the van they'd bought to replace the totaled one. This van had a lift for his wheelchair, purchased with money from insurance and borrowed from Carmen's parents. The drive to Maple Street took 15 minutes but felt like hours. Diego stared out the window at his neighborhood, wondering if he'd ever stop feeling like a failure every time he saw a restaurant or cafe. Carmen parked in front of the cafe. Through the window, Diego could see his tables and chairs, sitting exactly where he'd left them. The space looked almost ready, so close to being something beautiful. Carmen got the wheelchair out and helped him into it. His leg was still in a cast and moving hurt, but he'd gotten better at managing the pain. She unlocked the door and pushed him inside. The cafe was dim, with only weak daylight filtering through the windows. Diego rolled himself to the center of the room and just sat there, taking it all in. He'd spent hundreds of hours in this space, pouring his sweat and dreams into every corner. The paint he'd carefully applied, the floors he'd laid tile by tile, the kitchen where he'd planned to create food that would make people happy, all of it for nothing. He'd been so close. If the accident had happened 3 weeks later after the opening, maybe they could have hired someone to keep things running while he recovered. Maybe they could have made it work. But timing had never been on his side. Diego didn't realize he was crying until Carmen knelt beside his wheelchair and wrapped her arms around him. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the dream that would never be. Outside, people walked past on Maple Street, going about their lives unaware that inside this small space a man's hope was quietly dying. He knew what would come next. They'd load up what they could sell. They'd abandon what they couldn't. Mrs. Patterson would find a new tenant, someone else who had dreams and determination. The neighborhood would get a different cafe or maybe a cell phone repair shop or a nail salon. Life would go on. But for Diego, sitting in his wheelchair in the middle of his almost cafe, it felt like his life had stopped on that Tuesday afternoon when a pickup truck ran a red light. He'd spent 15 years building toward this moment, and it had all fallen apart in the time it takes to drive through an intersection. Carmen whispered in his ear, "We'll find another way. This isn't the end." But Diego knew she was just being kind. They were broke, buried in debt, and he was barely mobile. There was no coming back from this. His dream was over, and he needed to accept it and figure out how to move on with whatever came next. Diego asked Carmen to leave him alone in the cafe for a while. She hesitated, worried about leaving him in the wheelchair by himself, but he insisted. He needed time to say goodbye to this place in his own way. Carmen kissed his forehead and said she'd be back in an hour. She had to run some errands anyway. Might as well do them now. After the door closed behind her, the silence felt heavy. Diego rolled himself around the space slowly, running his hand along the walls he'd painted, the counter he'd installed, the windowsills he'd sanded smooth. Every surface held a memory. He remembered the day he got the plumbing to work without leaking, the afternoon Sophia helped him hang the light fixtures, the evening Carmen surprised him with sandwiches when he was working too late to eat properly. He stopped in front of the space where the espresso machine would have gone. He'd researched machines for months before finding the right one. It was a beautiful piece of equipment, barely used, from a cafe that had closed after only 6 months. Diego had wondered at the time what went wrong for them. Now he understood. Sometimes trying your best just isn't enough. Sometimes the universe has other plans and all your hard work doesn't matter. He was staring at nothing in particular, lost in thought, when he heard a knock on the glass door. Diego turned his wheelchair around, surprised. The sign said closed, and the place clearly looked empty. Through the window, he could see an older man, maybe in his mid-60s, wearing a simple gray jacket and carrying a worn leather briefcase. The man was looking directly at him, making a gesture that asked if he could come in. Diego's first thought was to ignore him. He wasn't in the mood for conversation, especially not with a stranger. But something about the man's face, a kind of gentle concern, made him change his mind. He rolled to the door and unlocked it, pulling it open. "Sorry to bother you," the man said. His voice was soft, with a slight accent Diego couldn't quite place. "I've been walking past here for months. Watched you fixing the place up. Then the lights went dark and I kept wondering what happened." Diego felt his throat tighten. "It didn't work out," he managed to say. The man nodded slowly. "May I come in?" "Just for a moment. I promise I'm not trying to sell anything or cause trouble." There was something about his manner that felt safe, genuine. Diego nodded and rolled back, making room for the man to enter. The stranger stepped inside, closed the door gently behind him, and looked around the space with appreciation. "You did beautiful work here," he said. "I could see it coming together piece by piece. I own a small repair shop 3 blocks over. I walk this route every morning on my way to work, and every morning I'd look in your window to see the progress." "Thanks," Diego said. The compliment hurt more than it helped. "Like I said, it didn't work out." The man set his briefcase down and extended his hand. "I'm Thomas Chen, and I have to tell you the curiosity has been eating at me for weeks." "What happened?" "If you don't mind me asking." Diego shook his hand. The grip was firm but not aggressive. He should have told Thomas to leave, that it was none of his business. But sitting alone in this empty cafe with all his dreams scattered around him, Diego found himself wanting to talk. Maybe because Thomas was a stranger. Maybe because he'd been holding everything inside for too long. "Car accident," Diego said. "Guy ran a red light 2 weeks before I was supposed to open. Messed up my leg bad. Broke some ribs, concussion, the whole deal." Thomas winced. "I'm so sorry." "That's terrible." "Yeah, and I didn't have disability insurance. Medical bills ate up my savings. Can't finish the work on the cafe, can't cook, can't do anything. Landlord gave me 2 months, but..." He gestured at his wheelchair. "This is it. I'm clearing out today. Done." The words came out flat, emotionless. Diego had cried himself out over the past weeks. Now he just felt empty. Thomas pulled up one of Diego's handmade chairs and sat down facing him. "How long did you work toward this?" 15 years. Saved every dollar I could, fixed up this whole place myself. Had the opening planned, menu tested, everything ready. Then 1 second of bad luck and it's all over." 15 years, Thomas repeated, shaking his head. "That's real commitment. That's a dream with roots." "Doesn't matter how deep the roots are if the tree gets cut down," Diego said bitterly. Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying Diego's face. "Can I tell you something?" "A story from my own life?" Diego shrugged. He had nowhere to be, nothing to do except sit in his failure. "Sure, why not?" 30 years ago, I owned a small electronics manufacturing business. Nothing huge, just me and 12 employees making components for bigger companies. I'd built it from scratch, started in my garage. Took me 8 years to get to the point where I could rent a real facility and hire people. I was so proud of what I'd created. Thomas paused, his eyes distant with memory. "One night there was a fire. Electrical problem in the building, they said. By the time the fire department got there, everything was gone. My equipment, my inventory, my office files, everything. And I didn't have proper insurance. I'd let the policy lapse because I was behind on payments. Figured I'd catch up next month. You know how it goes. Diego did know. That's exactly how it went. I lost everything, Thomas continued. The business, my savings trying to pay my employees their final wages. My house eventually because I couldn't keep up with the mortgage. My wife, she tried to stick with me, but the stress broke us apart. She left after a year. Took our daughter with her. I don't blame her. I was a mess, barely holding it together. What did you do? Diego asked, drawn into the story despite himself. For a while, nothing good. I felt sorry for myself. Drank too much. Pushed away everyone who tried to help. I was so angry at the world, at the universe, at myself. I thought my life was over. I was 40 years old and I felt like I'd already reached my ending, you know? Diego knew that feeling intimately. He was living it right now. But then something happened, Thomas said. I was at a bus stop middle of the day, probably still half drunk if I'm being honest. And this old man sat down next to me. He looked at me and said, "You look like someone who's given up." Just like that, straight out. I was about to tell him to mind his own business, but he held up his hand. "I know that look," he said, "because I wore it myself once." Thomas smiled at the memory. That old man, his name was Vincent, he told me his story. How he'd lost everything twice in his life. How he'd rebuilt both times. He said something I'll never forget. The universe doesn't care about your timeline. It only cares about whether you keep showing up. That's easy to say, Diego said. Harder to do when everything's falling apart. You're absolutely right, Thomas agreed. Vincent told me the same thing. And you know what he did? He helped me. Gave me a job at his hardware store. Paid me a fair wage. Let me work while I figured out what came next. Didn't ask for anything except that I show up on time and do honest work. Diego felt a flicker of something in his chest. Not quite hope, but maybe curiosity. What happened then? I worked for Vincent for 3 years. Saved my money. Learned to trust myself again. Started fixing small electronics on the side. Built up a reputation. Eventually opened a little repair shop, nothing fancy. That was 27 years ago. I'm still running it today. I never got rich, but I make a decent living. I remarried to a wonderful woman named Helen. Got to reconnect with my daughter once she was grown. Built a good life. Different from what I'd planned, but good in its own way. That's a nice story, Diego said, and he meant it. I'm glad things worked out for you. Here's the thing, Thomas said, leaning forward. Vincent told me something else. He said, when you get back on your feet, find someone else who's lost their way. Pass it forward. I've been looking for that person for years. Helped a few people here and there. But never felt like I found the right moment, the right situation. Until now, Diego felt confused. I don't understand what you're saying. Thomas opened his briefcase and pulled out a checkbook. The leather was worn smooth from years of use. What if you didn't have to give up? What if someone helped you the way Vincent helped me? I can't accept charity, Diego said immediately. Pride was about all he had left. It's not charity, Thomas said. It's investment. Investment in someone who has the heart to spend 15 years saving for a dream. Investment in someone who learned to do plumbing and electrical work himself, because he couldn't afford contractors. Investment in someone who built these tables with his own hands. He started writing in the checkbook. How much do you need for the medical bills? Diego's mouth went dry. I can't ask you for money. You don't even know me. You're right, I don't know you well, but I know enough. I know you're someone who works hard. Someone who had a dream and fought for it. Someone who got knocked down by something that wasn't your fault. That's all I need to know. But why? Why would you do this? Thomas looked up from the checkbook and his eyes were sincere. Because Vincent did it for me. Because I've done well over the years and have more than I need. Because I walk past here every single day and I want to see this place open. I want to see what you create. And mostly because I remember what it felt like to sit where you're sitting, thinking it was all over. He tore out a check and held it out to Diego. This covers your medical bills based on what you told me. And here's another check for 6 months' rent. That gives you time to heal, finish the renovations, and open this cafe properly. Diego stared at the checks, unable to move. The numbers were real. This was really happening. I can't. This is too much. It's exactly enough, Thomas said. But I do have one condition. Actually, two. Here it comes, Diego thought. The catch. What are they? First, you let me help you. I'm semi-retired, which means I have time. I'll come by and help with the work you can't do yourself right now. I'm pretty handy, learned a lot over the years, and I know some people who can help with the things I can't do. No charge, they owe me favors. Diego's vision was blurring. He realized he was crying. And the second condition? When you're successful, when this cafe is thriving and you're back on your feet, you find someone else who needs help. Someone who's had their dream kicked out from under them, and you do for them what I'm doing for you. You pass it forward just like Vincent made me promise. Diego took the checks with shaking hands. They felt unreal, like they might disappear if he breathed on them wrong. I don't know what to say. Say you'll open this cafe, Thomas said, standing up and extending his hand again. Say you won't give up. Diego shook his hand, gripping it tight. I won't give up. Thomas smiled, and it transformed his whole face. Good, now show me what still needs to be done. Let's make a plan. When does your wife get back? About half an hour, Diego said. Perfect. We'll surprise her with good news for once. Thomas picked up his briefcase and looked around the space again. This is going to be a great cafe. I can feel it. For the first time in months, Diego felt something besides despair. It was fragile and small, but it was definitely there. Hope. Actual hope. A stranger had walked through his door and changed everything. He didn't know why the universe worked this way. Why Thomas had decided to help him, why today of all days. But sitting there in his wheelchair, holding two checks that represented a second chance, Diego decided maybe he didn't need to understand. Maybe he just needed to accept the gift and make the most of it. When Carmen came back an hour later, she found Diego and Thomas measuring the kitchen area, making lists of what needed to be finished. Diego called her over, his eyes bright in a way she hadn't seen since before the accident. Carmen, this is Thomas. He's going to help us. We're not giving up. We're going to open this cafe. Carmen looked between them, confused, and Diego handed her the checks. She read them twice, 3 times, then looked at Thomas with tears streaming down her face. I don't understand. Why would you? Because someone helped me once, Thomas said simply. And now it's my turn to help someone else. Carmen couldn't stop crying. She kept looking at the checks, then at Thomas, then at Diego, as if she was waiting for someone to tell her this was a prank. But it wasn't. This stranger, this man who walked past their cafe every day, was offering them a lifeline when they'd been drowning. I don't know how to thank you, she finally managed to say. Thomas waved his hand dismissively. Don't thank me yet. We have a lot of work ahead of us. First things first, Diego needs to focus on healing. The checks handle the immediate crisis, but we need a real plan. Over the next hour, the 3 of them sat around one of Diego's handmade tables and talked through everything. Thomas pulled out a small notebook from his briefcase and started making lists, asking questions, understanding the full picture. He wanted to know about the permits, the equipment, the menu, the timeline. He asked about Carmen's job, about the kids, about their daily struggles. Diego had never been good at asking for help. His whole life, he'd been the one who figured things out, who solved problems on his own. But watching Thomas take notes, seeing the genuine interest in his eyes, Diego found himself opening up. He talked about his vision for the cafe, about the kind of community space he wanted to create. He admitted his fears about not being able to stand for long periods yet, about whether his leg would ever fully recover. Thomas listened to everything, nodding occasionally, asking clarifying questions. When Diego finished, Thomas sat back and studied his notes. Okay, here's what I'm thinking. The medical bills and rent are handled. That buys you breathing room. But you need more than money. You need time and help. He tapped his pen on the notebook. I meant what I said about helping with the renovations. I've got experience with this kind of work. But more importantly, I know people. My friend Henry does electrical work, retired but still takes small jobs. Another friend, Paulina. She used to manage restaurants before she retired. Between the 3 of us, we can handle most of what needs doing. I can't ask you all to work for free, Diego protested. You're not asking. I'm offering. And trust me, Henry and Paulina will jump at the chance. They're both bored in retirement looking for projects. This will give them purpose. Thomas smiled. Besides, I already texted them while you were talking. They're both interested. Carmen squeezed Diego's hand under the table. She could see him struggling with his pride, wanting to argue but knowing they needed this help. There's something else, Thomas continued. The money I gave you is enough for rent and bills, but not enough to hire employees when you open. You're going to need staff, and you can't do everything yourself, not while you're still recovering. We thought Carmen could help, Diego said, at least at first. Maybe the kid's part-time. Thomas shook his head gently. Carmen has her job, and you need that income and insurance right now. The kids have school. What if I propose something different? He explained his idea. His repair shop had been doing well. Well enough that he'd been thinking about cutting back his hours. What if he invested more time in helping Diego? Not just with renovations, but with running the business. He could be there during the early months, helping with operations, teaching Diego the business side of things he'd learned the hard way over decades. You know how to cook, Thomas said. You know food and hospitality. But running a business, managing cash flow, dealing with suppliers, handling difficult customers, planning for taxes and expenses, that's different. I made every mistake in the book when I started. I can help you avoid those mistakes. Diego felt overwhelmed. This is too much. You're already giving us so much money. I can't take your time, too. My time is mine to give, Thomas said firmly. And honestly, you'd be doing me a favor. Helen, my wife, keeps telling me I need a project, something to keep me engaged. This is perfect. I get to help you, and I get to be part of building something new. It's exciting. Carmen spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. Why us? There must be dozens of people who need help. Why did you choose Diego? Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. I walked past this place every single day for months. I watched Diego work. Some days I'd see him here at 6 in the morning, already sweating, already working hard. Other days I'd pass by at 9 at night and the lights would still be on. And there he'd be, still working. One Saturday I saw his whole family here, painting together, laughing even though they were covered in paint. He looked at Diego directly. I saw someone who wasn't cutting corners. Someone who was building something real with love and care. And then when the lights went dark, it bothered me. I kept thinking about it. Where did that hard-working man go? What happened? The curiosity wouldn't leave me alone. So today I decided to find out. And now I know. And now I want to help. It's that simple. It's not simple, Diego said. It's extraordinary. Maybe, Thomas said with a shrug. Or maybe it's just what people should do for each other. Vincent helped me when I needed it. I've been waiting for years to find the right way to pass that forward. This feels right. They talked for another 2 hours. Thomas met Sophia and little Diego when they came by after school, Carmen having texted them about what was happening. The kids were shy at first, but Thomas had a warm, easy way about him that put them at ease. He asked Sophia about school, learned she loved art and design. He asked little Diego about his interests, found out the boy was fascinated by cooking like his father. Sophia, your design skills could be really valuable here, Thomas said. What if you helped create the menu boards and signage? I'll pay you for your time, of course. Consider it your first freelance design job. Sophia's eyes went wide. Really? You'd trust me to do that? I saw the color schemes in here. Your dad told me you helped choose them. You have a good eye. Yes, I trust you. To little Diego, he said, your dad's going to need someone to help him test recipes while he recovers. Think you can handle that important job? Official taste tester and sous chef? Little Diego grinned. Definitely. Watching Thomas interact with her family, Carmen felt something shift inside her. For weeks, she'd been holding everything together through sheer force of will, trying to stay strong for Diego and the kids while secretly terrified about their future. Now, for the first time since the accident, she felt like maybe they'd be okay. Maybe this nightmare had an ending that wasn't complete disaster. When Thomas finally prepared to leave, it was early evening. He packed up his briefcase and shook everyone's hands. I'll be back tomorrow morning at 8, he told Diego. We'll start on a proper project plan. And I'm bringing Henry with me to assess the electrical situation. Sound good? Better than good, Diego said. I still can't believe this is happening. Believe it, Thomas said. And get some rest tonight. Tomorrow we start rebuilding your dream. After he left, the family sat in the cafe for a while, not quite ready to leave. The space felt different now. Less like a tomb of failed dreams and more like a project waiting to be completed. Diego rolled himself around, looking at everything with new eyes. Yes, there was still a lot of work to do. Yes, he was still injured and recovering. But now there was a path forward. Now there was hope backed by concrete help. Dad? Sophia said quietly. Is he for real? Like, this is really happening? I think so, honey. I really think so. Why would someone just do this? Little Diego asked. We're nobody to him. Carmen pulled her son close. I think we're about to learn that kindness doesn't need a reason. Sometimes people help because they can, because they remember what it was like to need help themselves. That night after they got home and the kids were in bed, Diego and Carmen lay awake talking. The house was quiet, but their minds were racing with possibilities instead of fears for the first time in months. Should we cash the checks? Carmen asked. What if he changes his mind? I don't think he will, Diego said. But yes, let's deposit them tomorrow. Pay off the medical bills immediately. Tell Mrs. Patterson we're staying. Start moving forward. I'm scared, Carmen admitted. Scared to hope again. What if something else goes wrong? Diego reached for her hand in the dark. Something else probably will go wrong. That's life. But now we're not facing it alone. Thomas meant what he said. I could see it in his eyes. This is really happening. Carmen was quiet for a moment. What he said about passing it forward. About helping someone else when we're successful. Do you think we'll actually be able to do that someday? I hope so, Diego said. I really hope so. Because I want to feel what Thomas must feel right now. That satisfaction of knowing you changed someone's life. That has to be the best feeling in the world. The next morning, Thomas arrived at 8 sharp, just as promised. He brought his friend Henry, a stocky man in his 60s with calloused hands and a tool belt. Henry walked through the cafe, examining the electrical work Diego had done, nodding approvingly. You did good work here, Henry told Diego. Real good for someone who taught himself. I can see a few things that need adjusting for code, but nothing major. We can knock this out in a couple of days. Thomas also brought coffee and pastries from a nearby bakery. Thought we could use some fuel, he said, setting everything up on one of the tables. Plus, I wanted to talk about your menu. What are you planning to serve? Diego outlined his ideas. Simple breakfast items, good coffee, homemade soups, sandwiches. Comfort food made well. Nothing fancy, but everything made with care and quality ingredients. Thomas listened and asked questions. Where would Diego source his ingredients? What were his price points? How much could he realistically produce given the kitchen size? Had he calculated food costs and profit margins? Some of these questions Diego had answers for. Others he hadn't fully thought through. Thomas pulled out his notebook again. Okay, this is where experience helps. Let me show you some things I learned the hard way. Over coffee and pastries, Thomas taught Diego about the business side of running a cafe. How to calculate what a menu item really costs when you factor in not just ingredients but also labor, utilities, waste, and overhead. How to price items so you're competitive but also profitable. How to manage cash flow in a business where income is daily, but expenses are constant. The food part, you've got that covered, Thomas said. I can tell you know your way around a kitchen. But a lot of restaurants fail not because the food is bad, but because the owners don't understand the numbers. We're going to make sure you understand the numbers. Henry and Thomas worked on the cafe for the next 3 weeks while Diego continued his physical therapy. Diego couldn't do much physical labor yet, but he was there every day, watching, learning, making decisions, and slowly taking more ownership of his recovery. His leg was healing slower than he'd hoped, but the physical therapist said he was making good progress. Thomas brought his friend Paulina by during the 2nd week. She was a sharp woman in her late 50s who had managed 3 different restaurants during her career. She walked through the space, asked Diego 100 questions about his plans, and then spent 2 hours with him and Thomas creating systems. Systems for inventory management. Systems for opening and closing the cafe each day. Systems for handling money. Systems for training employees. Systems for dealing with suppliers. All the invisible infrastructure that makes a business run smoothly instead of chaotically. You're going to be tempted to cut corners on this stuff, Paulina told Diego. When you're busy and tired, you'll think, I'll just skip the inventory count today, or I don't need to track that expense right now. Don't. The systems are what keep you sane and profitable. Trust me on this. Diego absorbed everything like a sponge. He'd thought he was ready to run a cafe because he knew how to cook. Now he was learning how much he didn't know, and instead of being discouraging, it was empowering. He had guides. He had teachers. He had people who actually wanted him to succeed. By the end of the 4th week, Diego was walking with crutches instead of using the wheelchair. The cafe was almost finished. Henry had completed all the electrical work and helped fix some plumbing issues they'd discovered. Thomas had painted the remaining walls and installed the final fixtures. Paulina had helped Diego create employee training manuals and opening checklists. Sophia had designed beautiful menu boards using a digital art program, incorporating warm colors and clean typography that perfectly matched the cafe's vibe. Little Diego had spent hours with his father testing recipes, offering honest feedback about what worked and what didn't. Carmen had used some weekend time to sew new curtains for the windows, soft fabric that filtered the light beautifully. As a family, they'd all contributed, but none of it would have been possible without Thomas and his friends. Without that moment when a stranger knocked on the door and decided to care about someone else's dream. The new opening date was set for mid-November, about 4 months after the accident. They sent out new flyers, posted on social media, reached out to everyone who'd expressed interest before. The response was overwhelming. People in the neighborhood had heard about what happened, about the accident, about the stranger who helped. The story had spread, and it made people want to support the cafe even more. "You've got something special here," Thomas told Diego one evening as they stood in the completed cafe. "Not just a business, but a story. People connect with stories of resilience and kindness. Use that." Diego looked around the space. It was everything he'd dreamed of and more. The warm lighting, the comfortable seating, the gleaming kitchen, the menu boards designed by his daughter, the hand-built tables. Every inch of it represented struggle and hope and the unexpected kindness of strangers. "I can never repay you," Diego said to Thomas. "You know that, right? What you did, the money and the time and the teaching, it's beyond anything I can ever pay back." Thomas smiled and put his hand on Diego's shoulder. "Vincent told me the same thing 30 years ago. You know what he said? Don't try to repay me. Just pay it forward. So that's what you'll do. When you're successful, when someone else needs help, you'll be there for them. That's how this works. That's how we make the world a little bit better." "I promise," Diego said. "I absolutely promise." The night before the opening, Diego couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind running through every detail. Had they ordered enough coffee beans? Were the tables arranged the right way? Would people actually show up? Would his leg hold up through a full day of work? Carmen rolled over and found him awake. "You're thinking too loud," she whispered with a smile. "Sorry, I'm just nervous. You're ready." "We're all ready. And if something goes wrong tomorrow, we'll handle it together." She was right, of course. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Carmen, the kids, and he had Thomas, who'd become like family over the past months. The cafe wasn't just Diego's dream now. It belonged to all of them. The alarm went off at 4 in the morning. Diego and Carmen got up in the darkness, both running on adrenaline and excitement. They drove to the cafe through empty streets. When Diego unlocked the door and turned on the lights, the space glowed warm and inviting. Home. That's what it felt like. A home for the neighborhood.